I will start with Dr. Elizabeth Wishnik, if I'm correct with your name. Am I right? Am I right, Dr. Elizabeth?
Yes, that's correct.
Good. Thank you very much for joining at Strategy International's webinar. My name is Dr. Mari Eftimiopoulos. I'm the CEO of Strategy International. And I'm going to be today your coordinator and your moderator, no more than this. So I really hope that you will enjoy this discussion. You will have your time to present. I mean, this is a free discussion. I mean, I keep it in 12 minutes in order to keep the interest alive, in the sense that others or people would like to ask any questions. But please let us know a few things about yourself. And also, let's go ahead to a very simple discussion into what is happening in Central Asia, what is happening with China, what is happening with Russia, considering these recent events.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to address this group. And with my illustrious colleagues on the panel, I'm looking forward to an excellent discussion. So I'm a senior research scientist at the Center for Naval Analyses, a nonprofit organization in Washington, D.C. And I'm representing my own opinions. I am an academic on leave from my university position, professor of political science at Montclair State University. And I'm also a senior research scholar at Columbia's Weatherhead East Asian Institute. And apparently all of the panelists have a Columbia connection today. So my area of research is China-Russia relations, Chinese foreign policy, and also Russian foreign policy. And so I'll just make a few comments about the China-Russia partnership and the recent summit between Xi Jinping and the 5 Central Asian countries that we've all been following with great interest. In March, Xi and Putin met for the 40th time, and they signed many documents, 14 agreements, where they announced a deepening partnership. And we can discuss what that means for Central Asia. But in one of their documents, they say that they plan to coordinate further in Central Asia, and that China would also engage more with the Collective Security Treaty Organization, the CSTO, which does not include China as a member. It's just Russia and some of the former Soviet states. And so that was one interesting development. Another interesting development at that summit was the fact that Xi and Putin did not sign a second gas pipeline agreement for the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline, which Putin had been enthusiastically talking about prior to the summit as being very close to completion. And this pipeline would go from Eastern Siberia across Mongolia and go to China. And so that pipeline agreement was not reached. And so that's another interesting moment from this summit. And so that takes us to the Central Asia-China summit that was just concluded, I guess last night or this morning. And one of the statements at this summit meeting was that China wanted to work towards the 4th line of a Turkmenistan pipeline to China. And so if that pipeline moves ahead, and there are many obstacles, I'm sure Bruce will talk about them, to that moving forward, China might not need the second Power of Siberia pipeline. And so I think that there's an interesting dynamic going on there where China is expressing some concerns about its energy security and in terms of its connection to Russia. So increasingly, China's been purchasing oil and gas from Russia. in the last year. And in one of their agreements at the summit between Xi and Putin, they indicated a concern for energy security for the first time. And I think this is coming from China, looking at all of the disruptions in Russia's energy partnerships and becoming a little concerned that it's becoming too reliant on Russian energy, and looking more to Central Asia to address that. And Russia has its own agenda, wanting to maintain its gas and oil deliveries to China, and trying to involve Central Asia in doing that on behalf of Russia. So we have a little bit of competition in that respect. And when I read the text of Xi Jinping's speech at the Central Asia Summit, what I saw was an effort by China to put forward its foreign policy priorities. So it's almost the 10th anniversary of the Belt and Road Initiative. The initiative got somewhat stalled as a result of COVID and concerns about indebtedness, issues of sustainability given fossil fuel investments and so on. And so here China's trying to reboot this cooperation in a way, and to flag some of Xi's newer initiatives, the Global Development Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, the Global Civilization Initiative. And so part of this meeting, I think, was a showcase for these kinds of initiatives. And what came out strongly in my reading of these documents is the security piece, that China has always looked to Central Asia in terms of its security, making sure that terrorist threats, separatist threats don't emerge from the region and harm China's Xinjiang region, which is of great concern for Chinese security. And of late, China has been focusing on the development of Xinjiang, turning it into an oil and gas center, trying to increase agricultural development at the same time that there's massive repression going on of the Uyghur population there. And so there's a lot of different socioeconomic pressures in this region. And they also, in China, take the view that economic development resolves security problems. Of course, it has never turned out that way for Xinjiang. It's only made them worse. But the idea is to engage more with Central Asia to facilitate this development of Xinjiang and to reduce the security concerns that China feels there. So we see a continuation of that, the highlighting of security. We see a concern over interference by other countries, meaning Western countries, primarily, although a lot of different countries are interested now in engaging with Central Asia, Turkey, India, Japan, just to name a few, Iran. So it's, although the interferers are not identified, I'm assuming that China's more concerned about, for example, the EU Central Asia Summit that's about to start, rather than Turkey's role there. A digital Silk Road was mentioned. That's another priority for China, exporting its technologies and also its approach to surveillance. And that is a subject of concern in many Central Asian countries. A lot of different economic agreements. To my mind, what this summit was more of a series of 5 bilateral summits with each of the leaders molded into one grand 5+1. Because I didn't really see a lot of collaborative engagements. I saw 5 separate pictures of Xi with each Central Asian leader, a series of agreements with each one, and then a grand declaration that was really more of a foreign policy agenda for China. So the devil will be in the details, how each country reacts to all of these different proposals. My most recent experience was in Kazakhstan, and I think that some of these projects are going to be a tough sell there. There was already a lot of concern about the previous agreements for industrial projects with China. The visa-free regime, I'm sure, will elicit concerns. And then there was a curious statement in the joint agreement about water issues, how they're going to address water issues, which have really gone nowhere in the discussions between the two countries. So I think a reaffirmation of Xi Jinping's foreign policy principles at a time when the G7 is meeting, trying to show that China has its own friends, even though it has a lot of tensions with other countries, that China is not isolated, that Xi's agenda is alive and well, and that it aims to have a safe and productive neighborhood. And just one last point, the Russian commentary has been kind of interesting about this summit. One strain of it is that nothing to see here. China and Russia plan to coordinate in Central Asia. The competition angle is overblown. And another angle is that, what about that debt trap diplomacy? You know, calling attention to some of the criticisms that we see in the Western media about China and Central Asia. You know, Russia doesn't do that. You know, so trying to show that China has some problems, that there's xenophobia in the region, and so on. And Chinese scholars often point to the fact that the Russian media tries to undermine them in Central Asia. So we see this continuing despite the deepening China-Russia partnership. So those are just some opening thoughts, and I look forward to the discussion.
And I think you have done the best opening speech that one can do for a lot of reasons. Probably, I mean, I do know that Bruce and Dr. Robert also may have tons of questions to also ask you, except the things that they will add into the discussion. But I will keep my own questions in the end. Because you have put a really good framework, and I think I will pass on now the floor to Bruce, so I can ask him first of all to thank you again, both of you or three of you, for joining us at Strategy International, but to also maybe ask a question that will follow up the discussion of in the introductory remarks of Dr. Elizabeth. Where does Russia-China's relation stand with regards to what is taking place right now? There's an ongoing war in Ukraine. There's an illegal invasion. Where do we stand as of now? I see it as an opportunity for China to be pivoting, and I think this is why we put the word pivot, which is not new, but now it is more operational in a sense, and we're much more we're much more suddenly looking at a greater extent and more depth probably on what is happening. It seems that Russia does the war and the fighting, and China does the rebuilding under the new conditions and the new order. Let's say in Central Asia, where basically both leaders of Russia and China say there's nothing to see here. So what is there to see, Bruce?
Well, first, thank you, and thank you for inviting me to be here. It's a pleasure to speak with such distinguished panelists. I'm glad that we're all together. I'm Bruce Pannier. Of course, I've been covering Central Asia for 3 decades. I was studying at Columbia University under Edward Allworth when he was there. I studied at Tashkent State in 1990. I was doing sociological research in villages in 1992 and 1993, and Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. I started covering it as a journalist, which was not what I majored in or ever took in university, but in 1995. And I've been writing articles for not just Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, who I used to work for, but I've also done stuff for Freedom House, The Economist, Jane's Intelligence, several others besides, and clearly I still follow events and cover the region more as a freelance correspondent at these days. Okay, your question: where is Russia and China stand right now? You know, this is interesting. I've seen a lot of people talk about how they're getting along and coordinating their activities in Central Asia, and obviously I'm going to speak from a Central Asian point of view throughout this. You know, there are places where they meet. Now, clearly, Russia's war in Ukraine has complicated its relations with a lot of countries. There's no doubt about it. I've never been one to really put a lot of faith in the Chinese-Russian friendship, to tell you the truth. They have a rocky history. I think that at this point, because China is still a growing power in the world, and its main opponent is the United States, that Russia is a convenient ally that it needs, and probably will be, even after the Ukrainian war is over, right? That it's still going to be a big country with nuclear arms, potentially dangerous to a lot of people. So that you know, it's a convenient ally. I don't see their strategies are aligned in that many places. As concerns Central Asia, certainly both China and Russia want stability and security in Central Asia because they border Russia and China. This region borders Russia and China. So instability in Central Asia is immediately bad for both Russia and China. Now, they also have an interest in seeing the regimes that are in place stay in power. They've been dealing with these people. All right, we've had a change in leadership in Kazakhstan, but not really a change in the form of government or their foreign policy. Kyrgyzstan's changed several times. It's a little bit erratic. But fortunately for China and Russia anyway, a small country that can't really have a huge impact on them. Uzbekistan's had a change in leadership, and yet the policies of the government are still pretty much in line with the previous government at the moment. So they would like to see these regimes stay in place because they know who they're dealing with, and they know that so far they've been able to keep order in Central Asia, which is really one of their primary priorities in dealing with Central Asia. Now, there are some differences, and I think this kind of shows the direction of where the region's going. Now, Russia does have problems in Ukraine. That's clear to the Central Asians, who have always looked upon Russia as the ultimate guarantor of their security, right? Now, whether they had good relations with Russia, bad relations with Russia in the case of Islam Karimov in Uzbekistan, or Saparmurat Niyazov in Turkmenistan, I think at the end of the day, they always had the feeling that if things were really, really bad, that they could cave in and call a Kremlin and say, well, whatever you want, please come and bail us out of this horrible situation that we are now in. And that Russia would be more than happy to do that. Can they do that now? That's a big question. It probably, I would say, as the Central Asian leadership is probably very thoroughly informed about the actual situation in Ukraine, they have to have a lot of doubts now about what Russian military help really means. If a threat comes over the border from Afghanistan, and it wouldn't be the Taliban invading Central Asia or something, but if a group of militants was able to cross the border and stage attacks in 4 or 5 cities, and the government didn't think they could handle it, would they call Russia in to help them now? What's the price tag for getting Russian help, and what happens when the Russians do come? If anything, we've seen from Russia's campaigns in Chechnya, Syria, and now in Ukraine, that Russian help means they're going to destroy the whole city and all the infrastructure around that. So they would leave a huge mess behind for the Central Asians to clean up, or take Russian loans or something to fix up and end up being more, closer to the Kremlin than they are or would like to be. Past that, of course, Russian officials, including Vladimir Putin, have made some odd statements about Central Asia, particularly Kazakhstan, where they've mentioned that there wasn't a state, there wasn't people living there until the Russians showed up. Parts of it, historically belong to Russia. Zyuganov made a comment, Gennady Zyuganov, the head of the Russian Communist Party, made a comment that maybe Baikonur should be reincorporated into Russia. Maybe Kazakhstan's nuclear industry should be appropriated by the Russians because they've laid the foundations for it, things like that. Obviously, this is unnerving to the Central Asians to hear this, especially when they look at Ukraine and see what's going on. They have to wonder if Russia was successful in Ukraine, would they be next? Actually, if Russia is unsuccessful in Ukraine and they're looking for a quick victory, would the Central Asian state be next? So there's a lot of questions about what the relationship with Russia is, not only now, but going forward into the future. This is an opportunity for the Central Asians to somewhat detach from Russia and distance themselves. There's a conversation going on in Central Asia now about colonization and what it was under Russia. This was something that they avoided for many, many years. They tended to look at this as we were part of the Russian Empire, we were part of the Soviet Empire, but now they're looking at it as we were unwilling participants in this. Unwilling, our territory was occupied by the Russian forces. We were forced to do this. Let's take another look at our history in the last 150 years and try to reevaluate exactly what our relationship with Russia should be viewed as being during this period. So that all works to Russia's disadvantage, without a doubt, going forward in the future. Now, one thing I would say before I pivot over to China is that, for good or bad, at least the Central Asian people know the Russians, right? And that's emphasized by the fact that we have 6 to 8 million migrant laborers that have come from Central Asia and are working in Russia right now. But they do have a history with Russia, and many people in Central Asia still speak Russian. Again, we have a whole another generation that's learning Russian because they have to be migrant laborers there. So there is already an established communication with Russia, which they do not share with China, right? So this is, when we look at China now, China is probably a more stable partner for Central Asia. Over the last 25 years, they've been on relatively the same trajectory. Looking at it, again, I'm looking at it from the Central Asian perspective, that China is just getting what they want. That Central Asia is a resource base for Chinese industrialization and modernization, that they look at Central Asia as a place with a lot of oil, a lot of gas, a lot of uranium, and have developed infrastructure projects to develop those industries with the view of bringing all these raw materials back to China to fuel their own economic development. Now, they have in the meantime spent what is probably a relatively small amount of money on helping the Central Asians out with infrastructure projects, besides the railroads, roads, and pipelines that all lead to China. That's kind of the hook to getting the Central Asians dependent upon them. It's true that no one is going to spend $500 million on the Rogun hydropower project in Tajikistan, although the EU has hinted that they might do that. But China just said they would spend $500 million on Rogun. But there's a lot of other projects in Central Asia, the thermal power plants in Bishkek, in Dushanbe, some of these other hydropower plants in other regions of Central Asia, that no other country is going to spend money on those kind of projects. But China will, because for them it's not that much money. And what do they get in return? They get the governments to be quiet when there's votes in the UN on Xinjiang. A solid ally on their western border, which is, China has 14 countries bordering it. And if you look at some of those countries, India, Vietnam, Myanmar, North Korea, who knows what's going to happen. And even now, of course, Russia there must be a lot of questions in Beijing about what is Russia going to look like after the Ukraine war? What will the government be able to extend its power throughout the country the way it has been so far, or is that going to be weakened? And we're going to look at some kind of instability that might even be in areas of Siberia on the Chinese border. But Central Asia is different. They've paid their way and gained influence to the point where they're helping to this day, as Elizabeth mentioned. They're giving them, surveillance technologies that are helping the regimes to keep in power, ultimately helping to keep stability in that region. The governments are absolutely rock solid allies of the Chinese government, so there's no problem coming from that particular corridor on the Chinese border that they have to worry about. They do have a lot of common interests that they play up. Obviously, 3 of the Central Asian countries and China border Afghanistan. So this is something else they have in common that they can talk about. And the Central Asians would be anxious to listen to. What do we do about Afghanistan? What do we do about these other groups that are allied with the Taliban or not allied with the Taliban, but are still active and operating inside Afghanistan? And one other thing I would mention before I go into the people's attitude would be one of the reasons we were talking about, Russian-Chinese cooperation, but China is really pushing the middle corridor. And, Belt and Road has largely excluded Russia. But the Chinese right now are really pushing the middle corridor. Now, the middle corridor is, of course, a competition corridor to the so-called northern corridor that the Central Asians have been using to run through Russia, that's been developed over the course of 150 years. And was really their easiest route to get goods into Europe. And they've been using it for the last 30 years, but China is pushing the middle corridor. So it kind of shows that how you want to look at that, business trumps political interests or foreign affairs or something like that. But in the meantime, if you're looking at this from Russia and see that China is really trying to get the Central Asians and the people in the Caucasus to open up these routes so that they have another way to get to Europe, It looks like they're trying to supplant the northern route that Russia has been depending on, that helps to keep them close to the Central Asians at the same time, and even ship Chinese goods through Kazakhstan and up through Russia. No, the converse is with the Central Asian people's view of Russians is almost the opposite of what they have to Chinese. They don't like the Chinese, the idea of Chinese people. They're worried about China taking parts of Central Asia long term. They look back historically. They look at the population in China. You're a country like Kazakhstan with 20 million people, and there's a neighbor with 1.3 billion people that accidentally has maps every now and then that show parts of Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, even Tajikistan as being historically part of China, the same thing that Russia has kind of said out loud. The Kazakhs are understandably worried about what a relationship with China is. That the average person in Kazakhstan, right? That if they, as it happened in 2016, if they were to rent land or lease land out to people, and the rumor spread that there would be 1 million Chinese in the country. This started a rare public unrest in Kazakhstan when Nazarbayev was still president. So it shows that public sentiment is really very cautious about Chinese influence. They don't like the fact that their governments are getting them into debt. Some of them don't like the fact their governments are reluctant or actually refuse to speak about what's out the campaign against Muslims in Xinjiang, especially since some of those victims are ethnic Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, and Tajiks. And they're worried that China will run out of room or run out of resources that it's willing to use at this time, and view Central Asia as a more likely place to just take them from if they can't come to some business arrangement where they can just buy it from the Central Asians, which so far they've been able to do without any problem. Just a little bit about the Xi'an summit which also shows that China can do things that Russia can't do. Okay, in the lead up to the summit, they started to announce their usual deals that they came to right before this. So now Kazakhstan's going to be able to export 20 million tons of oil to China. The pipeline was originally 10 million tons, right? So this sounds good to the Kazakh government. Probably sounds good to some of the people in Kazakhstan too, that they're going to have a source of money. They talked about the China-Kyrgyzstan Uzbekistan railway. It's some project that the Kyrgyzstan have wanted desperately for a long time, which will help move goods from China through Kyrgyzstan, so they get transit fees, possibly the option of shipping some of their own stuff through Uzbekistan and then on through this middle corridor, whether it goes to Caspian ports or through Iran. But it's a new connection for Kyrgyzstan, which breaks their isolation. And if you look at the map, you can see that they're not very well connected. Part of the problem of being a mountain country in the middle of the Eurasian continent. And then, of course, they had I mentioned Tajikistan, the Asian Investment and Infrastructure Bank announced that they were going to get $500 million for the Rogun Dam. Line D was kind of the loser in this. They made very vague reference that I saw to Line D. It was the usual, we're going to accelerate or put a new emphasis on construction of Line D. Well, there's not much being done to Line D, and there hasn't been in a long time. So what does put new emphasis mean on that? That could be very little. And there really didn't seem to be a big push to get Line D open, which Turkmenistan would like to see. So, while I'll just conclude by saying, while a lot of people want to say that there's really no competition in Central Asia between Russia and China, I think the Chinese are taking a much longer view of this and understanding that Russia is just going to kind of wane in the future, and that China has to just keep its level of engagement where it is, and maybe bump it up every now and then a little bit, or throw something added into it to keep the Central Asians in their camp. And they'll be able to do that for a long, long time, and Russia will not be able to do that for a long time. So that ultimately they will get what they want from the Central Asians, whether that's their raw materials or whether that's as a transit corridor to Europe or the Middle East. That's all going to come to them. And in the meantime, Russia's going to have a hard time maintaining such holds as it has in Central Asia at this current time.
Thank you very much, Bruce. I mean, that was excellent as well, and I think that also adds up a bit on the question that whether Russia does the fighting and China does the rebuilding. But one of the things that comes up into my mind is how do they generate capital except the use of natural resources of the area, or if they give them great loans, let's say through BRICS, for example, in order to sustain on the one hand BRICS and on the other hand to sustain their economies. But we don't know how long it will be value for the money that they actually spend. One of the examples was in Africa, Senegal, and China has spent a lot of money in Senegal. And although they've taken over, because that was part of the contract, we still don't know how they make their money and if they make their money too much with this respect. But we'll come back to this discussion. So I'm keeping several things from both of you, and thank you very much. And just before I move to Robert, to just say the following, that back in the days when I was at Columbia University as well, at Harriman Institute, I was dealing mainly near Russia. And part of the the research was also to see how the Caucasus reacts, and how how the momentum builds up for Central Asia. So back in the days, I remember it came down to the conclusion that something's off the ground with regards to Afghanistan and Turkmenistan and Tajikistan. It seems a few years ago I was kind of right in some of the things that I had. Definitely, I don't have that depth that you both have, but the idea was that something was off the grid, so Russia was actually exploiting, but they didn't know how to exploit it. Eventually, the Chinese would take over these lands. But one of the things that comes to the mind is, the Caucasus is far closer to the European continent and therefore much more directly impacted with the war in Ukraine. And I know that Dr. Robert is an expert with regards to what is happening in Caucasus and Central Asia. So I will now give the floor to Dr. Robert and tell us his expert opinion and just define us and complete, if you want, that puzzle of Central Eastern Asia, and Russia and China itself, and then we'll go to the further discussion. Dr. Robert, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Marios, for framing that, for framing my contribution in that way, and thanks to Bruce and Liz for being so willing to be a part of this. It really is a Columbia University Harriman forum here in its own way. I think that I appreciate Marios' suggestion also that the speakers should give a brief introduction, because if I tell you how I came to the study of Central Asia and the South Caucasus, it will lead naturally into, and it will elucidate the perspective on those affairs that I will then present. I started out as a Soviet foreign policy expert in the late Brezhnev era. And when the Soviet Union fell apart in 1991, I was fortunate enough to be a research fellow at the Harriman Institute. Can you imagine a better place to be in the early 1990s for 3 years? And for whatever reason, I've never really, asked myself the reason or sought a reason, but when that happened, I kind of lost interest in Russia. I had never been like, I came to Russian affairs, Soviet affairs through the 20th century, not through the 19th century, not through the culture, not through the literature, and so on. So I did not feel that there was anything intrinsic in Russian politics about which so many more people became expert in the 90s than there were before. So it was less fun, and there were all these other countries that were newly independent about which at the time we in the West knew absolutely nothing. And so that seemed to me to be a lot more interesting. Whatever I did, I would be creating new knowledge for some people. And so what happened figuratively, literally, I went to Kazakhstan in the summer of '94. stayed with a friend who was doing an MIA actually at SIPA at Columbia, who was in the foreign ministry. And what happened figuratively, although not literally, was that I fell into the Caspian Sea. I came up for air in Baku, Azerbaijan. When I got back to New York, my friend said, "Oh, you're an energy expert." So I said, "Well, sounds good to me. I don't want to disappoint my friends." So what I did, actually, I was interested in Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan even before I went there, just because they looked like interesting countries, I literally started in the Caspian Sea and I followed the energy pipelines wherever they went. And now, of course, they go from Baumgarten in Austria to Beijing. And so that's how I expanded my scope. I had been a West Europeanist back also during the Cold War before I became a Soviet foreign policy specialist. So my angle then was Soviet policy toward West European integration. But then Europe became, whole. And it all melded together into Europe and Eurasia. And because my training, my diploma is in political science and international relations, naturally questions of terrorism, security, and ethnic conflict factored into this, not directly into the energy aspect of things, but into general security affairs. So that's how I came to this. And I've just deepened, I'm not a China specialist, although I try to keep up with things. And these days you can do Russia 24/7 and still not know everything. So I keep up with Russian affairs also, but my focus is on Caspian, Central Asia, South Caucasus, and European affairs, focusing on energy amongst other things. Now, Dr. Wishnick has given an excellent overview, and Bruce has given so many wonderful details that give us a feel for the region. I would like to just add an elucidation or footnote or discussion. I want to zoom out from the details geographically that Bruce gave, and in space, and maybe try, in order to be suggestive and maybe even provocative, to look forward a bit, maybe 10, 15, 20 years. And will also provide fodder for discussion. Bruce mentioned the middle corridor. Not everyone may know what that is. So let me just give a little background and then I'll say more about it, because I think that it's something that bears further development in the context, in the framing context that Mario's provided. The middle corridor, the formal name is the Trans-Caspian International Trade Route. Sometimes it's called the TITR, sometimes it's called the TCTC. The middle corridor is actually, and that runs from China all the way to basically Southeastern Europe and further, okay? There are ideas that it could even be extended to Southeast Asia and into Central and Western Europe. The middle corridor is a subset of that. The middle corridor runs, depending upon how much you zoom out and how much you zoom in, either from Turkey to Central Asia or from the South Caucasus to Kazakhstan. There is an organization, the TITR, although from the Chinese point of view, it's an integral part, or it's supposed to be part of the Belt and Road, or the BRI. I'm not certain, Bruce could correct me on this, but I'm not certain that China has given a lot of foreign direct investment specifically to the development of this. For example, I know that the Azerbaijanis have built a modern multimodal port south of Baku at Alat. They did all that with their own money, and they insisted on doing it with their own money. I don't know whether the Chinese have contributed much to the development of ports in Kazakhstan and Ataru and Kurik. I don't think so. So it's not really Belt and Road. And the takeaway from what I want to say is that over the next 20 years, this corridor, this, if you visualize it on a map, like behind me, you can also find it on Google Maps. It's a way for Central Asia to escape the Russian-Chinese vice grip. Now, this was initially an initiative of Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan and Georgia. Of course, getting across the Caspian Sea is the most important part. It's the hardest part right now. And then the consortium was formed, and then they have associates and partners, which do not include any other Central Asian countries besides Kazakhstan. Uzbekistan's not a member, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, it's only Kazakhstan. But on the European side, you've got Romania. Before the war, you had Ukraine. Even the Polish railways are interested, and they're actively participating, and Bulgaria and so on. So the volume of trade through the TITR/middle corridor is small at the moment. But now I want to put that in the geopolitical context, the geoeconomics and the geopolitical context. There is, because this is also set in the context of a development plan stretching out till the 2040s that was adopted multilaterally by something that few people have heard of, called the Organization of Turkic States. I know everyone on this panel has heard of it. It used to be the Turkic Council, now the Organization of Turkic States. It's a full-fledged integration organization. It's not supranational like the EU, but it has its own parliamentary assembly. It has judicial cooperation, although no supranational judicial body, customs, interministerial conferences, expert sessions, and so on and so on. Now, what's important to know about the OTS is that this wasn't and isn't Turkey's idea. This was put forward in 2009 by Kazakhstan as the Turkic Council, and it was propelled in 2000, just a few years ago, when that was all transformed into the OTS, Organization of Turkic States. Also, that was Kazakhstan's idea. Turkey didn't get it. They were like, well, you know, we'll sign some construction contracts. Yeah, that's cool, you know, for Erdogan's political base. But they didn't get it. I mean, if you really want to go back, this goes back, think about Mehmet Özal, and back in the 90s. This is kind of like his vision, but this is not driven by Turkey. This is driven by Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan, because they have a lot of capital, because they're energy exporters, and because actually even before the reignition of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, even back in 2017 and 18, Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan were ramping up a lot of bilateral cooperation, not only in energy, but even going beyond energy, because this is not intended in the first instance to be an energy corridor. It's a trade corridor. It's a commodities corridor. It's a transit corridor. So Marios mentioned the Caucasus, which I wasn't really going to, but it's very pertinent now, because just to mention this as an aspect of the discussion of the TITR/middle corridor, is that a really big part of this will be, I do use the future indicative tense, will be the Zangezur corridor, which goes across southern Armenia. It is 26 miles wide. It joins the main body of Azerbaijan to its exclave Nakhchivan, which has a border with Turkey. And Armenia committed itself in the November 2020 trilateral declaration signed with Azerbaijan and Russia in Moscow to make this happen. And it's going to happen because Armenian State Railways are literally a subsidiary of Russian State Railways, and Russia wants this to happen. Paradoxically, it's not necessarily, you know, the first instinct, but Russia has no communications over land, that is to say, with Turkey, except like through Georgia. There's one mountain road that's frozen up for like 4 or 5 months of the year. But there are established railroads through Armenia. Through the corridor, there was a railroad, and so it can be rebuilt. Okay, through Armenia, and then up through north through Armenia, through Dagestan into Russia. Russia would really like to have those connections because it gives them direct access to Turkey for trade and all other kinds of things. Now, I'm not going to go into the Armenian domestic politics. That's a different issue. I will mention that things are really accelerating this very month. There was a very significant meeting of the two foreign ministers, Azerbaijan and Armenia, in Washington, hosted by Blinken. This is one of those meetings, one of those rare diplomatic meetings that really has made a difference. There's an acceleration of negotiations between the two sides with a peace treaty in view. On the 25th, there's going to be, and then that was followed just a few days ago by a high-level meeting with Aliyev and Pashinyan in Brussels, mediated by Charles Michel. On the 25th, there's going to be another foreign ministers meeting in Brussels. On the 29th, there's going to be a top-level meeting in Moscow. And on the 1st of June, there's going to be a top-level meeting in Chisinau, Moldova, where you have the European Political Committee, this Macron initiative. There's going to be Michel, Macron, Scholz, and Aliyev and Pashinyan. So things are there are always all kinds of roadblocks that could arise, but that's on the way. That's on the way. And it's remarkable how and we don't know how and when it's going to come about, but when the Zangezur corridor is opened, that's going to make a big difference, not in the short term, but in the medium to long term, or for the countries of South Caucasus, for Central Asia, Kazakhstan in particular, and because it also gives them a geoeconomic, a geopolitical. Now I'm going to zoom out in the time, because in some of my more academic work, by the way, I'm not a university professor. I left the academia about 20, 25 years ago to do more policy related things and to write journalism, to write policy papers and so on. But I am properly credentialed and taught in a number of countries, including Canada and the US. I'm originally from the US. And to conclude now, to zoom out, is that in my more academic work, in my more academic work, I'll mention two things. Before the Russians reinvaded Ukraine, I am on record on a YouTube conference presentation predicting that the current constitution of the Russian Federation will no longer be in force by 2045 or 2050. Now you can interpret that the way you want, whether it falls apart, whether it's whatever. But that's the way that I put it very specifically. And this is based not on anything in Russian dynamics. This is based on Russian history from 1567 until the 23rd century, using some fancy complex systems analysis. And so within that context, what I'm saying is that in other academic work based on the same kind of approach, I have for quite some time said for at least 10 years, I've said that the international system is going to break down in the early to mid 2040s. There's going to be a dozen years of chaos, and then there's going to be a new international system emerging in the late 2050s. Sort of like, what happened in 1989, 91. It's going to be different, but like, if you want to know what an international system breakdown looks like, that's what it can look like. Now, what's going to break it down, how it's going to evolve and so on, that's if there are questions about that, I'll answer those questions, but that's not what this webinar is principally about. However, that's the context in which I say that if and when this TITR and middle corridor are developed, especially with American help, American economic and political assistance, like they did in the South Caucasus and energy in the 90s, because the EU doesn't really have the means to do it, then this will provide those countries, including Central Asia, with the means to establish their relative autonomy, not their absolute autonomy, their relative autonomy of Russia and China, by giving them an extra support, and that this will shape the things to come until 2040, 2043, and then that will knock on with follow-on effects for how the next international system will establish itself and evolve. So I'm saying, to conclude, that this middle corridor, TITR, it's a nascent, it's not a power base, they don't have hard power, but they're growing countries, economically important, and just like the US and the UK, by the way, through BP, helped to realize the Southern Gas Corridor, which was, by the way, an initiative of Baku. It wasn't an initiative of Washington or Brussels. It was Baku's idea. And they own the main pipeline through Turkey. That in the same way, if the West provides sufficient assistance in a consistent and helpful way taking into account the feedback from those regions, which now have a very highly well-trained cadre or personnel in all of the technical fields that we are interested in for economic development, then this can break up the Chinese-Russian vice grip over Central Asia over the long term. That's where I'll stop.
Thank you very much, Robert. And I think we with those three speakers, we're now concluding a very, very clear-cut picture about Central Asia, the view of China, the view of Russia. So things that may come to one's mind, and I will use a prerogative to start this discussion. And I think I'm going to be a bit provocative, so we can start discussion with it. Is how does this affect South Asia, for that matter? Because I know also that Russia and China are actually pivoting in those areas. This is number one question, and I'll give the floor to all three of you. And the second question is, what can the West learn from these realities that you just mentioned, all three of you? Because it is really important, and I will start the engagement about how the West can learn something from the point of view that some opinions were raised with regards to this Ukrainian-Russian war, that this war, this involvement of Russia and the invasion of Russia to Ukraine would happen anyways, because we kind of read the Russians wrong. We read them in a Western way. We're not trying to read them in a different way. So where do we stand in the lessons to be learned with regards to what is happening? I know I've been asking this question from the beginning, but all three of you are more clear into defining and describing those elements. But it seems that both China and Russia will play a very pivotal role in Central Asia. They're playing already, but probably in the negotiations, in the trade agreements, in the rebuilding, in the reconstruction, which will create a momentum also for Central Asia, or the opposite. So where do we stand on that? I will start with South Asia, the question of South Asia, and then once the round of this question will go, we'll go back to what the West can learn from the presentation from the three of you. So Dr. Elizabeth, the floor is yours.
The South Asia question is a very interesting one, but it's also hard to answer unless we know what's going to happen with Russia and Ukraine. Because Russia has succeeded in managing partnerships with two countries that have a tense relationship with one another, China on the one hand and India on the other hand. And both India and China have been beneficiaries of increased oil deliveries. India hardly imported any oil at all from Russia, and now more than 20% from Russia. Before it was less than 1%. So India has been somewhat more critical of Russia and Ukraine, but still a supportive partner. And now we'll see India taking up the chair role for the SCO and the G20. And so it's going to be very fascinating to see how Russia navigates between China and India right now. But in the future, and when the questions arise, if Russia is severely weakened by this war in Ukraine, what will China demand in terms of India? So Russia supplies a lot of weapons to India. India and China have a border dispute that has become more militarized of late. And so the balance of power among these countries has real significance for global peace. So that's certainly one issue. The other issue is that India, I think, is viewed positively in Central Asia as an alternative to China and Russia. And so India has a potential to invigorate that role and to take advantage of that goodwill. Because I think, follow on what Robert said about the middle corridors or the escape route from the neighborhood predicament that Central Asia has, being stuck between Russia and China. I think another way out is through an energy transition away from fossil fuels. And so enabling investors from the EU, from other countries to come in and to support those industries. So I think, South Asia could play a role in providing an alternative to these countries in terms of their geopolitical space stuff there.
Thank you, Dr. Elizabeth. And I think, just for the audience who's listening and watching, if you want to ask any questions, please write on Q&A if you want me to add anything. I think you're right with respect to, things are happening at this point. Everybody's waiting to see how the war in Ukraine will go. But again, while we are waiting how the war in Ukraine does develop, it seems that through, in the middle way, the rest of the global economies have been shaken and reshaped, and somehow this enabled all these discussions about how to utilize more lands, more countries, and so on and so forth, probably from China and Russia also to multiply. And the same question was for the Western powers to how to mobilize more and more allied countries in order to make sure that they have the resources enough to be competitive, if you want, in an otherwise very global competitive environment that is not really friendly to just a peaceful way of doing trade. We'll come back to this. Bruce, what do you have to say on South Asia?
Yeah, I mean, this is a great topic because the one thing that the process had already started before Russia invaded Ukraine. That the Central Asians, and of course I'm always speaking from the Central Asian point of view here, is that the Central Asians had already explored like the possibility of southern routes. It was a dream since independence, right? That you would be able to export or do trade to the south, both to the Middle East and to in places like India. Unfortunately, when your neighbors are Iran and Afghanistan, it was kept pretty much at the dream level because there wasn't much they could do. But despite the fact that the situation is rather unfavorable for trading through the South right now, still, they've actually made a lot of progress since Russia launched the war in Ukraine. For instance, the first shipments between India and Central Asia overland, which admittedly are modest, but still have taken place last year, where they did shipments by truck of cargo that reached Uzbekistan from Indian ports. Because of the problems between India and Pakistan, you can't ship anything overland; it has to go by port, by sea. But still, it showed that this was like a new determination to kind of open up this southern route one way or another. And there are now they have put into operation several railway lines that are connecting Central Asian states to Iran. And the Central Asian leaders have been in Iran to talk about this too, that, the possibilities of using Iranian ports in the Persian Gulf as a means of shipping their goods. Tajikistan, for instance, just a few months ago, launched its first multimodal system whereby goods come in from China by truck, and then they hit a railway in Tajikistan and go across Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and down into Iran, right? So this is something that would have been, if they had been approaching it, they've been thinking about it, but they didn't take the final step until Russia launched the war in Ukraine. And all of a sudden their trade routes through the north were complicated. So they're making extra efforts. Again, they're modest at this point, but you can see that this is already starting to develop and that they're putting new emphasis on getting the trade routes through the south. It explains in part why the Central Asians have taken an attitude toward the Taliban of at least calling like a truce and an understanding, right? They are not I wouldn't say in great terms with the Taliban, but they have a dialogue open with the Taliban. And part of the reason is because they want Afghanistan to become a place they can trade through to get to India. And the last comment I will make on that is I had mentioned how there's a xenophobia in Central Asia, a tolerance and knowledge of the Russian people. India has, as someone who's traveled all over Central Asia, India has this bizarre, unique attraction for the Central Asian people. It's connected with Central Asia through history. It was an ally during the Soviet days. When people talk about India and Central Asia, they speak about it very favorably. I mean, they would be very happy to be able to trade with India and have even closer connections than they do right now. So, ultimately, if they could open up that trade corridor, it would I mean, Indian influence would probably come flooding into Central Asia if it was possible. So it's something the Central Asians want, and it's something the Indian government and Indian people are certainly aware of.
Thank you very much, Bruce. And I think that completes a lot of things. Although I would like to add in this equation that I think from, because both Dr. Elizabeth and yourself, I actually mentioned the relationship between India and Russia. I think the winner out of these is India. Exactly because you explained that the southern corridor is far more easier, although it's still a bit complicated or underdeveloped, if we can call it like this, with regard to the northern corridor of transport. But India is the big winner out of this. And I think that was made quite evident, especially the way that their foreign policy is now shaped and the attention that the world media gives to how India reacts. With regards to China and Iran, this is quite interesting in a discussion that was apparently secretive since 2016 and developed in 2021 with the presence of the Chinese, where for the first time on their agreement with Iran was the presence of 5,000 Chinese troops in the Iranian soil in the Arab Gulf. So that was quite interesting in the decision and their massive investment otherwise into Iran. And it seems that, it built up on a momentum for Iran to start thinking on the geopolitical changing landscape. And I think that's where it was more evident that they went even harder against Israel, even harder against the US, even harder against the Western ideology framework. Probably because the Chinese were to invest far more and far greater. So, Robert, I will give you also the floor. Maybe you want to add also something about South Asia yourself, and then we can go to what we can learn from the West.
Yes, South Asia, it's problematic, as Bruce pointed out. There are these mountains in the way, basically, that are very hard to surmount, so to speak. So South Asia, of course, is not a cohesive whole. It would be necessary to break it down by country, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, and maybe Myanmar, and then look at them individually in relation to Central Asia. I want to say a few things about, Iran, because it hooks in to this, because Iran has come up. There have been allusions to, I'll name the port Chabahar, which is in southeastern Iran, which is used by India for the import of goods from the still fabled, not working north-south, international north-south trade corridor from Russia. And India participated, I think India actually runs Chabahar port now, with Iran agreed to that a couple of years ago. India also built or has been building a railroad track up north of there that was allegedly going to be the export route for raw materials that China would allegedly mine in Afghanistan, which hasn't happened yet. And so, in fact, you have, I wouldn't call it an alliance, it's more of an entente. India, Iran, Armenia in this part of the world, because Armenia is a Russian client and an Iranian ally, and has been since independence. Without going into the details about the wars, about how Iran has always been hostile to Azerbaijan, even though they're both Shiite Muslim countries. That's a different topic. But just to point out these India, Iran, Armenia, and Russia, although you can't go through Armenia to get to Russia because George is in the way. Entente block. And I'll just put a footnote. Elizabeth knows this, but she didn't mention it. Although the 20% of the oil India is now importing from Russia, this is with an American okay. and it's being refined in India and re-exported. So that's just the detail there that the listeners may be interested in. As for Central Asia, yes, everything Bruce said about Iran and Central Asia, I'm sorry, India and Central Asia is correct and to the point. Pakistan was going to have a route through into southwestern China. Pakistan, unfortunately, has been falling apart for the last 15, 20 years. They had an earthquake that basically probably destroyed a lot of infrastructure projects, and now China's calling their debts on the BRI. So it's unclear whether Pakistan can play a constructive role in Central Asian or even Chinese relations. Afghanistan is a different topic. People know the contours of that in general. I won't say more about it. And Myanmar, there's the energy pipelines going through Myanmar that help to avoid the Malacca Straits, which are a choke point for Chinese imports from the Suez direction. So I don't see South Asia as a whole playing any big role. And it can't be, let's put it this way, it can't be a pole of attraction. It can't be a pole of attraction for Central Asia. It might do a little bit here, India might do a little bit here, it might do a little bit there, but it's not going to be a pole of attraction for them. Concerning the EU, Elizabeth Wishnick is correct that, and in fact it already has happened, that as she knows, that the EU has signed memorandum of understanding with, in particular, Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan for the implantation of wind and solar generated wind and solar technologies for the generation of electricity locally. That's not going to be, and also Azerbaijan is even going to export some of it via a Black Sea cable that has recently also been agreed under the Black Sea to Romania. But that's not going to, I don't, from my standpoint, it doesn't seem like it's really going to make a difference. The EU doesn't have any hard power, and the amount of electricity that you can generate using wind and solar techniques is not enough to make a big difference to these countries. Azerbaijan, it might make a small difference because if they can use that electricity domestically, that will free up more natural gas that they can export through the Southern Gas Corridor to Europe. That's the one exception. But for example, the EU and Kazakhstan signed a memorandum of understanding, I guess last year, beginning of this year, for the export of electricity from Kazakhstan to the EU. I mean, how are you going to get it under the Caspian Sea? How much electricity are going to lose in transit? I mean, this is, just a diplomatic flourish. It seems to me, I would be very surprised if that's ever realized. And if it were ever realized, it wouldn't make a big difference to many people. So I'm not as certain that renewable energies, they're a useful diplomatic tool. And Azerbaijan is doing it because the EU wants them to do it. That's fine. But it's not going to be, the EU doesn't have the wherewithal, especially given its oncoming, its current and deepening, and to still be further deepening industrial decline, because they won't have enough energy to produce enough goods to satisfy their populations. I don't see the EU having the wherewithal, diplomatic, economic, certainly not financial, because they depend on the Fed, the US Fed, for everything, wherewithal to be an important player on a diplomatic level, on a symbolic level, on a general, like, if they still wanted to export values. I mean, it's not trivial. I'm not saying it's trivial. I'm just saying it's not like South Asia. It cannot be a real pole of attraction. It can be a diplomatic advocate and diplomatic rhetoric, but when push comes to shove and you do things on the ground, the EU doesn't have many instruments to offer that would make a geopolitical or even a geoeconomic difference. So that's, which is why I come back to the US which for some reason, I'll just end on this point. I don't know how it happened, but somehow in the State Department in the last year or two, someone has realized that it's an important part of the world again. You know, in the 90s and the 2000s, it was center stage. And then after the failure of the Turkish-Armenian rapprochement, which was pushed by Obama and the Democratic Party, which is heavily influenced by the Armenian Americans who are very important in the Democratic Party politics in California and in Washington, have a very influential lobby, they lost interest. I mean, American diplomacy in general lost interest. Other things happened. There was a financial crisis, got to deal with that, and so on. But now, for some reason, it's coming back. And the US is the only one who, if they want to, can really be a player still in the region, besides Russia and besides China, not to the exclusion of the EU, not to the exclusion of India, but the US can make autonomously a difference. They can make events follow policy tendencies of development over the middle and long term, whereas India and EU don't have that capacity to drive events and phenomena and international phenomena that emerge out of the concatenation of events over time.
Thanks, Robert. And I mean, I have to disagree a bit as a European citizen. It's complicated and very bureaucratic into how to take decisions. And in fact, the EU may not have the hard power as one may exhibit that the US may have, but it did have NATO so far, and NATO was in Afghanistan, and that was more than 62 countries being involved, so it also included the EU. So hard power was seen. The EU policing missions and the EU reconstruction missions also in those countries as well. I would also agree with the fact that probably countries which have the capability to think more global at that very moment, which is a characteristic of the United States, is that it can pivot again and can reconsider West Asia in this case, or the Caucasus, if you want to call it, or the Middle East. And in fact, it is an actor. I mean, it has been an actor so far, but the EU has a totally different approach with regards to how it comprehends the West Asia or Central Asia by itself. The values are different, the approachment is different, the operational approachment is different. Probably when the discussion about potential integration within the EU framework and institutions, that's where the real discussion starts about swift and strong decades of changes before the actual entrance into the EU happens with regards to institutions, rule of law, democratic values, the way that the Europeans may understand it. And I think this is quite vividly different from the US. But having said that, the reason why I said this is exactly because you gave me an opportunity to just open the discussion about our next question, which will be also the last round of questions, because as I see, our audience does not have any Q&A. So, after this, I will conclude. But I want to know, why is this discussion important for the West? What are the lessons to be learned? Let me put it very clearly. Why should we care about Central West Asia, East Asia, considering these, huge geostrategical challenges and changes taking place with new alliances, new trade agreements, new potentials, new and pioneering innovations, and also a lot of threats, a real existential threat. So where do we stand with this, Elizabeth? I think I will start with you again this round, and thank you very much once more.
Thank you for that question. I would say that one of the, you asked earlier, what have we learned? And I think one of the wake-up calls of the current war in Ukraine is that we have to be concerned about sovereignty issues. And of course, Russia is the country in Central Asia that everyone is worrying about. It's called toxic in many places in the region, but China also raises questions. I think China sounds nice in its agreements talking about sovereignty, but recently we had the PRC ambassador to France, Lou Shaye, raising questions about the sovereignty of post-Soviet states in general.
Indeed, indeed.
And that wasn't, maybe Bruce has found more discussion of this from the region, but from what I could find, very little has been said publicly in response to that, but I'm sure people are talking about it. And so I think that there's a lot of concern about this whole space and the ability of these states to withstand a lot of external pressures. And one thing I am also concerned about is a tendency when the US pays attention to the region, as Robert said, we do this episodically, is to integrate it into some strategic perspective. So in the 2000s, it was the war on terrorism that made Central Asia important. Now it's the strategic competition that will likely influence the way we see the region, which I don't like these great game analogies, because one part of the US government is looking at the agency that Central Asian states have and trying to encourage regional coordination by facilitating inter-country trade and so on. And so I think that the US has its own C5+1, and that agenda so far has been trying to focus on developing regionalism from within, not to anchor, because we're so far away and we're not going to be the one on the spot, but to try to make these regimes more resilient on their own. So I hope that message is not eclipsed by the strategic competition one, which, while important for context because of the neighborhood in which these countries live, it should not be the only focus. And my point about energy transitions was not to say that we can end fossil fuel use in Central Asia, but to say that the point is for these countries to develop industries, processing, industries, autonomous industries that are not dependent on outsiders to the same degree, and they might be able to focus renewable electricity on their own region rather than looking to the EU or something. So the point is to make, because China's economic package for Central Asia is very driven by what China wants to import. It wants to import food, import energy, and then process it elsewhere in China. So that's a losing situation for the region. So I hope we learn that this is a region that needs a sustainable development model, not just pawns on a strategic chessboard, and to think carefully about how that contributes to the sovereignty and sustainability of these countries as independent states, because we want them to be independent states. First and foremost, I think that should be one of the things that we learned.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Bruce?
Yeah, thank you. Just follow up on that. I agree. I'm happy when people talk about the Central Asian states having their own agency. The hook for someone in the West, though, especially in the United States, which, as Elizabeth pointed out, is a long ways away. You just have to look at the map to figure out why Central Asia might be important to you. When Russia is to the north, China is to the east, and Iran's to the south. It's good to make sure that you have relations with the people in Central Asia. To speak about the kind of people that we're talking about too, there's been a lot of problems between the West and the Islamic world too. The Central Asians are Muslims, and of course I've lived with them, and they are, they're among the most literate Muslims in the world, heritage of the Soviet Union. But they follow things. They're very curious, very informed about what's going on in the world when the opportunity is there to get information anyway. This would be a good ally, not only because of where its geostrategic location, but also for the fact that, to try to position Western countries in a place where they have strong alliances with Islamic, nominally Islamic countries. All right. And the Central Asians are more than happy to do this. I mean, they've been stuck with the Russians for a long time. They're worried about their alliance with the Chinese. They, even from day one, and I was out there practically on day one, they really wanted good ties with the West. Is the United States the one in particular to do that? That's the only question I have, is because unfortunately, they have many people have a jaded view of the United States that they inherited from the Soviet Union, right? So when you're out there, there's questions about what are the motivations for the United States having any interest in Central Asia at all? And invariably, most people think that it's just part of U.S. Contemporary interests, whatever, and certainly what happened in Afghanistan kind of shows that. But I would also add, what happened in Andijan and Uzbekistan too, where the West stood up to the Uzbek government, it seemed like, for a while, and calling for an independent international investigation of what's happened, and yet invited them to come to the NATO conference, the Karimov to come to the NATO conference just a couple of years later, so they can open up the northern distribution network. But I think the Central Asians would be willing to be stronger allies with the U.S. now, more particularly the European Union, right? Because I've worked with the EU, and when they come over, they're coming over as representatives of a group of countries to talk with the representatives of a group of countries. They understand that Central Asians are five individual countries, but they speak with them regionally too, and that message resonates a lot better with the Central Asians than when China, Russia, or the United States do it. Those are big superpower countries, right? And they feel small when they're dealing with them. Whereas the European Union is something they seem to have a better connection with. And of course, everyone uses the Silk Route stuff all the time. And just to get the last word, to get the energy supplies out. Now, everyone knows the European Union needs to do something to substitute for what they're losing from Russia. Again, here, the Central Asians would love to have the European Union as a customer. The European Union pays on time, pays high prices. The problem is just connectivity. And this is something where the US, as Professor Cutler mentioned a while ago, that when they were really interested and they pushed it in the Caucasus in the 90s, it ended up with results. We got the BTC, the BTE, all these networks that didn't exist prior to that when the US showed an interest. And if the US would show an interest, even giving it support, publicizing it more often, the things like the Middle Corridor, it would really help out to get these energy resources redirected westward instead of eastward, which is something that I think ultimately the U.S. profits from too. It frees up their European partners from having to worry about who they're buying gas, oil, whatever from.
I think you're muted, Dr. Eftimiopoulos.
Thank you very much. And thanks for saying my last name correctly. But the last words are for you, Dr. Robert. And I think with this we'll complete, because it seems that we have a very good and solid understanding about how the world works, considering Central Asia. Robert, Dr. Robert.
Thank you. In the course of my last final remarks, I'm going to be making a few references to the big picture, and therefore I wish to preface them by agreeing fully and endorsing Elizabeth Wisniewski's remarks about the need for the autonomy of these countries and of the region, even if driven partly by the interests of so large and still important and powerful a country as the United States. I guess she knows better than I do the plurality of views in Washington about how to look at Central Asia, whether it's an instrument or whether it's an actual place where where people live. American foreign policy has always distinguished itself from the policies of European states, partly because the American people, and this is why they supported the UK, the Britain, when Edward R. Murrow was there in the bombing, and it was actually a European who pointed this out to me, is that Europeans always think in terms of power politics when it comes to foreign policy. But if you look at the social basis of American foreign policy, the American people don't like to see bad things happen to good people. And I believe that that's an asset both to the US public and foreign, and also to the people in the region from Central Asia and the South Caucasus, because we've all met and know many of them, and by and large they are more than they're good and impressive people, and so that's positive. I want to register that because remarks I might say later, I might make later, might seem to exclude that point of view, but I want it to be very clear that I endorse that, and there's not necessarily a contradiction between the US interest or the European interest from a macro angle and the interest of the countries in the region from a meso or a micro angle. They coincide. They can easily coincide. I believe they do coincide. So that having been said, I simply want to index, it hasn't been mentioned, is that the Asian Development Bank has always also been, they do a lot of very good work, studies, including on the middle corridor and the TITR. I just wanted to mention that. Of course, they don't have, all they do is they fund people to make studies. They don't actually much fund things that happen on the ground. In terms of Elizabeth's comments further about renewable technologies and other sectors of the economy driving economic growth, I'd like to expand that view to mention, which I didn't mention before, is that the TITR and Middle Corridor also have a significant potential to expand economic growth in these countries, because there are a lot of secondary economic sectors besides railroads, besides airport construction, besides port construction, that will have knock-on effects that will follow on. For example, and also over the middle to long term, people will migrate to the corridor. That's where the jobs will be. And one of the most evident, not the only, but I mention it only because it's the most evident, sectors that can be built out and provide the economic growth is information technology, and in particular, the rollout of broadband to the companies that will be using this transit corridor. The large enterprises have no problem getting internet. Medium enterprises, sometimes yes, sometimes no. But in order to have the economic growth that guarantees the political stability in these regions, you want the small and medium enterprises. And those are the ones who will need and do need the broadband internet. The rolling out of which could be driven, amongst other things, by the further development of the TITR. I've already mentioned that there's a coincidence of interest, in my view. I think everyone here, I'm sure Elizabeth would agree, between the view, the autonomy-seeking tendency of the countries in the region looking outward, and the view of the US looking at the region that wishes to promote its autonomy, very much like it did with the countries in the South Caucasus, 25 years ago, for that matter. So I will conclude now with the big picture, having made it clear that I don't believe that this crowds out any other perspective. That, and also from the 15 to 20-year perspective, I believe it's clear to anyone who reads the headlines that the international system, which includes the economic system, is undergoing a decoupling, with a technical word in complex systems of bifurcation between not just the US and China, but I hate to use the word blocks, but you can use a different word. But, and also, footnote, I mentioned this in a paragraph in something, I predicted this something like 20 years ago in a paragraph in an article that was on something else. Russia, China, and Iran are classic revisionist powers. A revisionist power is a power that loses a war and wants to change the settlement. Everyone knows World War I, World War II. They lost the Cold War. They were unhappy with the outcome of the Cold War. They want to change the settlement, Russia, China, and Iran. And, you know, some of their further client states. And it is for this reason that China is seeking to turn both Russia and the Central Asian states into imperial subalterns. To be blunt. On the other hand, it's not just the United States. What is opposing, because it's underway. This process is underway. We might not like it. We might want to change the language, but it's been underway for 5 years or more, actually 10 years. And now it's just becoming more and more evident with China sealing off all their economic data from anyone being able to find it, closing all of their information space to sinologists, and basically Xi Jinping reimposing central Maoist, Stalinist planning. That may or may not be a controversial statement. I could substantiate it if anyone has any doubts. I overstate it because I'm trying to be brief, but it's the essence of what's happening. Opposing that, you have not the US, you have an entente, I'll call it an entente, of the Five Eyes plus the Quad. Five Eyes are US, UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, although New Zealand is kind of like an outlier now. And the Quad, you know, the Indo-Pacific Quad is the US, help me out, Japan, Australia, and India. Adjacent are South Korea and Taiwan. They're like Quad adjacent. India is Quad adjacent, and so you have this coalescence of interest between the one block, the Five Eyes, which is for the sake of being brief, defined in security terms because it's intelligence sharing. But what they also share is a system of common law. A system of common law is necessary, although there are Europe has civil law, but common law is what makes a predictable business environment possible that is not state driven. Civil law in the UK, in Europe, in the EU, it's state driven, but common law is what makes it possible for, and the history of common law is what makes it possible for companies to sign contracts and to have confidence that the other company will adhere to the terms of the contract. That's not entirely true in civil law, which is in fact biased in favor of state actors and doesn't come from the bottom up, it comes from the top down. It doesn't honor you can't have judges ruling precedents that become future law in civil law systems. They have to follow the code, whereas in common law systems you can have judges at the bottom who create new law to go with the new circumstances. Examples can be given in all kinds of sectors and aspects outside the business community, but that then become established law, and therefore it's a dynamic system that adapts to new circumstances. So I want to just, and India also has this, and Japan also has this. So it's not just like a strategic political security, quote unquote, block. When I'm talking about the Five Eyes plus the Quad adjacent powers, it's an economic, financial system of common values and common practices. And that's to go beyond the pure security and military aspects. That's the bifurcation that's happening now in the world. And it's going to govern the evolution of the international system for the next 20 years, as it has been evolving for the last 5 to 10 years. And in that context, I believe that I only have to mention that given everything that we've talked about, that the place Central Asia and the South Caucasus, they're put into relief by this backdrop of broader geopolitics and geoeconomics, and the fact that these countries have the potential for autonomy And they can even drive the further evolution of the international system as the 2040s come around, as the 2050s and the 2060s come around. They will be able to drive that if they develop now and are assisted in developing the capacity for this kind of autonomous action in all spheres of state activity. And I'll stop there.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for this discussion. It was really very, very interesting because it is not common, especially in the European area and the continent, to speak so vividly in such depth about the importance of, let me say, East Asia, Central Asia, Caucasus, and then go into the south parts of Asia, and then see how the Western world can react with. I'm very glad we had this discussion. And just to tell you that Strategy International is a think tank, the idea of the think tank and the reason why it was established to engage into these global discussions. I believe that these discussions are actually missing from the actual political equation because we're all looking at our regional approaches. No matter if we say about the engagement of globality, but globality is not really there at the moments where it actually matters. Other countries like the United States, for example, which have a role to play in the countries that they engage with, actually plays a very important role to have constant analysis, which is not something that is really common in the European continent on the analysis of the things as they are. So thank you very much for this. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for watching our another webinar on Strategy International. We'll look forward to having you in our sessions to see and hear more from our experts and our invited guests. So thank you very much. Thank you.